Hello, welcome to Cashcraft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we will be doing Aratus of Sicyon and Artaxerxes II of Persia. So yeah, I know some of you might note this is not ancient Greece and Rome respectively, as most videos have been formatted. This is actually ancient Greece and Persia respectively. But Plutarch, despite this, he still called the book Lives of Noble Grecians and Romans, and despite the second live being about a Persian, it's largely related to Greeks and still relevant. And I don't feel like renaming just one of the videos. I'd rather keep them all the same. I'm sort of a OCD or sort of a perfectionist in that matter. And yeah, so I guess we'll begin. So this quote, usually I start with a quote from Plutarch from the beginning, but this actually comes later in respect to Artaxerxes, and I'm sorry if I already really banged out this point a lot or really emphasized this point in the life of Dion, but regardless, I'll still go over it. For it is cowardly fear in a tyrant that leads to most bloodshed, but bold confidence makes him gracious, mild, and unsuspicious. So among wild beasts, those that are refractory, and hardest to tame are timorous and fearful, whereas the nobler sorts are led by their courage to put more confidence in men, and do not reject friendly advances. So basically what he says, and he relates humans to dogs, which may be fairly or unfairly so, but basically a cruel tyrant is one who is insecure about their place in society or insecure about their rule, whereas a good leader should be confident and put trust in their people. And we'll see that sort of as a common theme that comes up in both of these lives. So yeah, let's begin with Aratus. So interestingly enough, this is probably the only live that was actually dedicated to particular individuals. So he actually, it says, I send it to Polycrates and Pythocles, so they may be reared after examples found in their own family line. So these people were in ancient Greece at the time, and they lived at the same time as Plutarch, and they were direct descendants of Aratus. And he kind of goes on to actually open this chapter by saying, originally there was a quote by Chrysippus who said, those who praise their father are the generous sons. And then he criticizes this by a quote by Dionysiodorus, who says it's the degenerate sons who praise their parents. But Plutarch kind of notes that they're both sort of wrong in that people should learn from their ancestors, but those who derive fame, success, and virtue solely based on the merit of their upbringing are less meritorious than those who earn success in their own right. And that's what he hopes Polycrates and Pythocles end up doing. He hopes that they read this and they learn. They don't take it as a ego boost, but they take it as a lesson to live more like Aratus and different in different respects. So yeah, so starting off with Aratus. So he Doris, he was from Sicyon, which is part of ancient Doria, which was descendants of Hercules originally, but they'd fallen from their aristocracy and they've fallen into a long reign of tyrants. And ultimately, the reign of tyrants following the death of Cleon finally ended with Timocles and Clinias. And these two individuals, for the first time ever, Sicyon was confident that they might actually achieve leaders who were not tyrannical. But quickly after this, an individual named Abantidas replaces Timocles, and he kills Clinias. So once again, they get another tyrant. And he sees Aratus, who's actually the son of Clinias, as a potential heir to the throne of Sicyon. So he tries chasing him down, and Aratus is only 7 years old at this time. But strangely enough, Abantidas' own sister grants him safety in her own house and then sends him off to Argos against his wishes. And this is, apparently she saw some sort of godliness in him or some sort of supernatural force in him and thought, despite her brother's wishes, she would save this child. And eventually he ends up being the one who saves the city. So we'll get to that soon. So despite this, as growing up in Argos, he had a hatred for tyrants. Rightfully so. He was almost killed by a tyrant, and his own father was killed by a tyrant. But he became quite well educated in the liberal arts at the time, and he was, I would not say an outlier at the time, but in terms of intelligence, but he did receive the proper upbringings, or the most respectable upbringings. But most notably, he was a very skilled athlete. He competed in pentathlons, or palestras, as they called them in ancient Greece, and he won many crowns in up to 5 games. So pretty impressive athlete. So he won the respect of a lot of people, particularly in the lower classes. I think this was particularly important in both Greece and Rome, or probably throughout all history. People very much respected royalty when they got their hands dirty and involved themselves in physical activity, and rather than just eating or living a opulent lifestyle. So they really respected him for that. So many people start getting upset with Abantidas' rule. So there's and he's exiling a lot of people. He's the tyrant back in Sicyon. So many of these exiles start supporting Aratus, and they sort of want Aratus to come back, whether as a tyrant or as a leader. They just wanted a sort of a refresh. So eventually a new tyrant comes into Sicyon. So I suppose Abantidas passes away, or passes it on to this other individual, Nicocles, who's probably an even worse tyrant. And not only worse in terms of cruelness, he's also just worse in terms of being a leader. He nearly loses the entire state to the Aetolians, and he only holds the city for a 4-month period, where when Aratus ultimately decides to go and get him. But Nicocles is sort of nervous because he hears, because many of the exiles are talking about wanting to reinstate Aratus, who is probably rightful heir, rightful king of the city-state. So he sends spies to Argos to keep an eye on Aratus. But Aratus nonetheless is gaining popularity and preparing himself to take the city. So, just a small point too, Aratus was also offered or convinced by many people that he should perhaps go off to fight Antigonus in Macedonia, or fight Ptolemy off in Egypt, but he decided that his future, or his best bet, was in his own hometown of Sicyon. So I guess that might just be a telling anecdote of his character. He was not perhaps blindly looking for ambitious pursuits or blindly looking for a challenge. He was also humble in his objectives. So he was focusing more on a local issue to start with, which is probably a good trait of a leader. So what he does is he sneaks up to the city of Sicyon in the night, and they climb up the rough part of the wall with ladders in the middle of the night. And once they capture the guards, and they warn all the people that they're starting a revolt, and many of the people, or most of Sicyon, come to support him, and a big revolt breaks out because they were very partial to Aratus, and they wanted to get rid of Nicocles. So they surround the temple, or surround the palace, and ultimately the palace lights fire. Fortunately, or unfortunately for Aratus, fortunately for Nicocles actually manages to escape through an underground passageway, but nonetheless, Aratus manages to become king, and he takes the spoils of the palace and distributes it amongst the army and amongst the people, which is obviously a very favorable thing to do. And supposedly only one citizen was killed in this rebellion, or revolt, I suppose we'll call it. So what happens is, once again, many people who are once again worried that Aratus would get tyrannical, and they're worried that it would just be the same thing to happen. So he does probably the most uncommon thing that any leader would consider doing. He joins the Achaean League. So this would be like similar to joining like the EU or something. And essentially what he's doing is he's putting aside some of his powers and giving some of his powers to a greater body. And this is a very humble thing to do, and this settles a lot of the a lot of his people, because they no longer feared that he'd become a tyrant when he already limited his power so much. And what he does first is he actually just serves as a general cavalry soldier. So he proves that he is willing to fight like a good and honest soldier, and he's respectful to everyone, even the lowest ranked soldiers. So he wins a lot of respect, not just amongst his own people, but amongst all the people of the Achaean League. He becomes friends with Ptolemy of Egypt, because he had been Sicyon was actually one of the capitals of art at the time in Greece, and he had been sending a lot of paintings to Ptolemy. So Ptolemy actually provides him with a lot of financing too. He offers him another interesting anecdote is originally he offers him 25 talents, which is a good sum of money, but Aratus decides that he wants to meet Ptolemy in person, so he actually takes a risky voyage down. He's almost captured by the Macedonians, and in doing so, he wins even more Ptolemy's respect, and Ptolemy offers him 150 talents. So, I guess just indicative of his character, that he was not fearful in terms of traveling, and it rendered him a great deal of support, his bravery and also his proactiveness. And additionally, the people of Sicyon were so happy with the money he raised that they erected a brass statue of him, which was stood amongst many of the or amongst where many of the old tyrant statues had been. So many of the old tyrant statues had been taken down at that point. So with all the financing, and after gaining a lot of fame amongst the Achaean League, he gets elected as strategos, which is essentially like military commander of the League of Nations. And they also managed to get Macedonian allies, which is interesting as well. So his first ever military endeavor as the strategos of the Achaean League was a fight to save the Boeotian army, the Boeotians were an ally of the Achaean League, and he manages an army of 10,000 soldiers, which is quite an impressive feat, especially at a young age. I think he was only in his early 30s at this time, so pretty impressive. And coming from a small town, he proved to be quite famous and quite popular amongst the allies. Corinth was a city that was known because it had really protective walls, and a long time ago they were captured by Macedonia, and they maintained under their rule and control for a long time, and it seemed pretty much impossible to really free them from the Macedonian rule. So what he does is he finds these 4 Syrian brothers who had actually robbed the king of Macedonia in Corinth, and they were taking shelter in Sicyon. And they reveal to him that there's a small part of the wall, which is supposedly only 4.5 meters, which is actually still quite a climb, but they find that this would be the way, if they do want to breach the walls, this would be the way to do it. So he rallies up he also pays these individuals who are thieves. They were thieves, but he offers them 60 talents, much of the money that he raised from selling his wife's own jewelry. So I think an interesting point to note here is that he is not he didn't discount these individuals just because them being foreign or because they were criminals. They had something to offer him, and for that he thanked them, and for that he respected them. So I think an interesting virtue you could learn from him. So he gets an army of 400 men from the Achaean League, which is obviously very small and doesn't seem like a strong enough army to take on the Corinthians. But during the night, he takes 100 of his best men, and he climbs through the secret passageway and captures Corinth, or saves them from the Macedonians. And many of the Corinthians were very happy that this was happening, and he raised them all in the theater area, and he's holding a sword, and they all are cheering him on, and he returns the keys, which is sort of a symbolic symbol of the leadership of Corinth, back to the people. Interestingly enough, Plutarch notes that he's holding the spear with his right hand, and we'll also see a similar case with Artaxerxes, who also or Artaxerxes' right hand was, or his father's right hand was longer than the other. So I wonder if he included this because he thought there was some inherent difference between left-handed and right-handed people. I'm not sure, but it's important to, I think, just make note of these small details. But either way, he wins a lot of fame in Corinth and much more fame across the Achaean League. With this, many other states joined the league, such as Megara, Troezen, Epidurus, and many of them just breaking off from their Macedonian control. He has a quote, and to sum it up, he says that the states of the Achaean League were all weak individually and could not be able to defend themselves, but together they are strong. And I guess this is just echoing his main belief and main hopes for Greece. He wanted to see a united Greece, and he wasn't partial to any particular regions. He allied with the allies, with the Athenians, with the Spartans. He really just wanted to unite all the people, and he wasn't doing it for his own self-interest. He was only strategos, which is just a military commander, whereas he could have been a tyrant back in Sicyon and just doing as he pleased and exercising absolute power. So very, very respectable. So he tries freeing Argos, and he actually fails. He isn't able to free them because they were supposedly so used to tyranny, which I think this is sort of surprising because he grew up in Argos. So I would have thought, whereas many of the city-states were ready to accept him as their savior, Argos, of all the places, wasn't. So I think that might just be, maybe they knew him too well, maybe they knew something that the others didn't, and they didn't support him coming back. But either way, he took a lot of beatings. It's wounded thigh, and he ends up actually defeating Aristippus, who was the tyrant, but soon his brother comes back into place, and it just seemed like Argos wasn't really ready for the Achaean League to save them. The Megapolis actually joins as well, the Achaean League, but many of the individuals start losing trust of him because he's starting to look like he might have ambitions of being overly powerful, or he might use his political or his military power to become some kind of emperor of the Achaean League. So, but either way, they sort of hit their peak. At this point, the Achaean League was pretty massive. It encompassed almost everything but Sparta. It included Athens as well. And Athens was one of the later states they saved, and he sort of proves his intent in saving it. He actually breaks his own leg when trying to save Athens or free Athens and unite them with the Achaean League, and he breaks his leg and he keeps on fighting. So a very impressive and very respectful thing of him to do. So in Sparta, as another live I covered was Cleomenes, who was obviously a great general. Sparta starts getting more powerful again, and they actually manage to capture back Megapolis. So things start going downhill for the Achaean League and for Aratus at this point. Additionally, fortunately, Antigonus, back in Macedonia, his son allies with the Achaeans. So they were pretty much at their peak at this point, but they were starting to lose states because Sparta was getting more and more powerful, and not only did they not want the Achaean League to take them, they also wanted to take more themselves. So Cleomenes sort of gives them their last chance after he starts taking some states, most notably Megapolis. He asks the Achaean League if he could be strategos, which was obviously a big ask, and Aratus was kind of hesitant. But what he does is he brings his whole army outside of Argos, which is very threatening. It very much threatened the Achaean League. So they asked them that if they just bring 300 soldiers into the city so they can have a dialogue and sort of discuss what is to become of Greece. But he says no, and he declares war on Aratus and the Achaean League. So I don't think Cleomenes actually had any. I think if he was offered to be strategos, he probably would have taken it, but he would have quickly become tyrannical because he just wanted the power. And as for the any sort of peace treaty, I don't think he really had any intent of doing that unless it was a zero-sum game in his favor. So Aratus is sort of granted the job of policing, because there's a lot of people who are not as faithful to him anymore, or as faithful to the Archaean League. So he's actually sort of goes through the people and starts killing a lot of people. So it's obviously starts losing a lot of their success. Cleomenes takes Corinth. Actually, interestingly enough, Cleomenes, despite his ambitions, he was actually very respectful to Aratus, and when he takes Corinth, he doesn't take Aratus' estate or doesn't sell it off, and he actually protects his estate and offers Aratus a 12-talent pension. So he offers Aratus a way out. Maybe it was not as kind as it seemed, because 11 talents isn't that much to someone who was potentially, or was, king and one of the most powerful people in all of Greece. But either way, Aratus obviously doesn't accept this, and he has this quote, "Now I don't govern affairs, instead they govern me." So he feels as though he is fallen out of power, cast out of paradise, and with that, Cleomenes actually ends up taking his estate, and the war begins. Aratus really loses his fame in the Battle of Carphae, where he is defeated by the Aetolians, and he and the Achaeans had a better army, or were more suited to actually win the war, but they have some very poor ground. It's very hilly terrain, and they get the lower ground, and they are defeated, and they lose much of the Peloponnese. So very unfortunate, he loses a lot of fame there. He eventually becomes so powerless that he offers to give Corinth back to Macedonia in order to get their support, and this obviously would upset the Macedonians, who thought he was their savior, and just sort of gave it back up, and sort of goes back on everything that he intended. So kind of not a great move in that regards. And yeah, this was, well, actually, I think it was also partially out of necessity, because at this time, Sicyon was actually, his own hometown was being ravaged by the enemy, so he offers up Corinth. So this is kind of going back on what I said earlier. He was most loyal to his own hometown, and although he had ambitions of running a full united Greece, at the end of the day, he saw his future, or his legacy, was in Sicyon, so he was willing to give up other states for his own home. So, yeah, and they, after hearing that he planned on giving up Corinth, they plundered all of his, the Corinthians plundered all of his treasures and everything that he had won, so they were not very happy with him. So eventually Antigonus III comes out, and he actually supports him, because he does give him Corinth, and he brings 20,000 soldiers, 13,000 cavalry, and it's very surprising, because the Macedonians, you would have thought, would have not wanted to work with Aratus, because they had a poor history. They had fought each other many times in the past, but Antigonus III actually respected Aratus, and they actually got on very well, and they managed to sort of sweep back through Greece. They took Argos, they took Corinth back, Mantinea, and Cleomenes is actually forced to flee to Egypt. So maybe a small concession, giving Corinth back, but they managed to ultimately win the war. And despite their every reason to hate each other, Antigonus III and Aratus actually become very good friends. There's a sort of anecdote, they're at a outdoor theater, they're watching a show, and it starts to rain, and they share a cloak, so obviously very good friends. He once, during a sacrifice, saw two gallbladders joined, and they thought it was a sign of their friendship, where friendship out of two potential enemies. So they got along very well, and after taking Mantinea, Aratus even named Mantinea Antigonia, and Aratus then became his chief advisor. So I think maybe he had a change in beliefs. He obviously wanted a united Greece, but if it's a united Greece under Macedonia, under a good ruler, it could be just as good. And I don't think although he was partial to Sicyon, I don't think he was really partial to any other state. He respected Corinth just as much as Athens, just as much as Persia. So I guess very objective in terms of his views. Eventually, Antigonus returns to Macedon, and he dies fighting the Illyrians. And his nephew Philip V becomes king of Persia, and he is sent to Aratus to sort of start learning. And they get along very well, actually. He admires Aratus just as much as his uncle did, but his royal advisors are sort of conspiring against Aratus at this point, because he's obviously foreign. He's some Greek guy getting very involved in Macedonian politics, or the Macedonian hegemony. And they suggest that Epiratos becomes Strategos, but Philip is still loyal to Aratus at this point and punishes them and actually makes Aratus the Strategos again. So he obviously had a way of winning the respect of people regardless of where they were from, which is pretty impressive. But at this point, the Achaean League starts to dissipate, because I don't think, despite Philip V controlling much of it, they're not really loyal to the Macedonian rulership, and they sort of just want to be independent again. And with this, the Aetolians and the Spartans, who were many times enemies of Aratus, saw this as an opportunity, and they they start to plot an attack on both Aratus and Philip V and their empire, we'll call it. And with this, they start picking away more and more states, and then Philip V starts becoming very tyrannical. He probably gets his ego sort of gets to his head, or his power sort of gets to his head, and he starts causing a lot of murders, and starts becoming very just as Plutarch notes, if those who are fearful of their subjects or fearful of their own power are the cruelest, and that's what he sort of starts to be here. And he even starts sleeping, when he's staying at Aratus' house, he sleeps with his stepdaughter, so Aratus' son's wife. At first Aratus doesn't know, but obviously not something you should do to a man he respects. He also starts plotting Messene. He wants Messene to have a civil war, and this becomes one of the main contentions between Aratus and Philip V. So he tries to start a civil war between the magistrates and the demagogues, and by doing so he ends up killing 200 magistrates. So because he wants to plot the two groups against each other. Aratus is very upset by this, and they have a discussion on Mount Ithome, and he says to Philip V, "You've conquered almost all of Greece, but you don't control the people's emotions, whereas a king's strongest fortresses are both popular confidence and affection." So he's sort of telling Philip V here that, echoing once again what Plutarch noted, that leading through fear or leading through cruelty is much weaker than leading through popularity, and that's what he hoped to do. But this, Philip sort of starts empathizing with his advisors here. He starts to see Aratus as maybe someone who's not fully aligned with his own interests, but despite this, he lets Aratus stay as Strategos, and Philip V goes off to fight some Romans, and he loses, and this probably got him in a very upset mood, so he ravages the state of Messene. And this once again really upsets Aratus, because he's causing even more harm to this sort of innocent city-state, and it's not particularly important to either of them, but it's sort of just a point of contention, and it's sort of what sparks a division between the two of them. Additionally, it said that Aratus at this time finds out that Philip V was sleeping with his son's wife, which obviously upset him. He never told his son, so I guess he still respected Philip V, or he was so scared of him. But Philip ultimately decides that he has to dispose of Aratus, because he's just sort of fed up, and he's probably angry that he had been losing a lot of battles, and he had also been told by his advisors that he should do so. So while he's gone, he gets his general Torion to give Aratus some slow affect poison, and he slowly dies. And Aratus has this final quote as he's dying: "These are the consequences of a king's love." So I'm actually not too sure what this is in respect to. Are these the consequences of him loving Philip V? Possibly, because he did love him and he did support him. Is this the consequence of him loving Philip V's father, Antigonus, and he loved his father so much that he ended up blindly supporting Philip V? Or is it that he loved all the people of Greece so much that he just wanted to support this guy? Or was it that he was doing this all for Sicyon? So it's hard to say, but I think it's probably, maybe he meant it to be multi-intended. So maybe he just meant these are the consequences of a king's love, because he's was a loving person. But either way, he proved to be very different from all of his contemporaries. Just like, he grew up in a time where everyone in his own city-state were fighting to become tyrants of it, and he chose to do something completely different, go complete opposite direction, and join essentially the Union at that time. So very interesting individual here, and we'll talk more about him in the comparison. Okay. Moving to Artaxerxes. So his father or his grandfather was Artaxerxes, who was the son of Xerxes. So Xerxes was obviously the one who waged war and almost took all of Greece, and very powerful individual and great legacy, sort of echoing back to the quote here that he didn't use the fame of his family. He wanted to earn fame in his own right, but we'll get to that more. Once again, his grandfather, who was also named Artaxerxes, was known as the long-handed. So he had his right hand was longer than his left, which I think is, I don't know why Plutarch delves into such details like this. Maybe it's just a fun fact, but I think it's there for a reason. Maybe it had to do with, maybe he thought there was some correlation between a love of war or violence in the right hand and a love of arts in the left hand. I'm not sure, but he makes sure to note these. But either way, Artaxerxes II, who is the one individual we've been talking about today, was known as the Mindful, because he was very, very smart and he had a good memory. And he was actually, his original born was Arceus, and once he does become king, he gets the name Artaxerxes, which means King of Kings, sort of just to solidify his power. But his father, Darius II, so Artaxerxes the first son, his own father, Darius II, had 4 sons. Artaxerxes was the eldest. The second eldest was Cyrus, which is named after Cyrus the Great. This is Cyrus the Younger. Cyrus actually means son in Persian. There was also Osthenes, Orathres, or Oxythres, and Oxythres. So the latter two, Osthenes and Oxythres aren't that important, but Cyrus sort of is a main point of contention. So Cyrus, unlike Artaxerxes, who was mindful, very quiet, very calm, and very kind, Cyrus was very headstrong, very vehement, very violent, and Cyrus was actually the mother's favorite. And when their father Darius II starts getting ill, he starts plotting to become king instead of Artaxerxes, because Artaxerxes II was actually heir to the throne because he's the eldest, so he should get it. And their mother actually supported Cyrus rather than Artaxerxes. Not sure why this is. Maybe it's kind of similar to, I wouldn't even say maybe similar to Alexander, in that she supported him. Maybe it's because Artaxerxes actually had a different mother than her, or maybe she just enjoyed Cyrus's temperament more. But either way, they had the case that Cyrus was born when Xerxes was reigning as a king, whereas Artaxerxes was born while he was just not reigning as king. So that was the grounds that Cyrus should be king rather than Artaxerxes. But for Artaxerxes quickly takes the throne, and obviously he changes his name because it was originally Arceus. He changes it to Artaxerxes, which is his grandfather's name, and it means King of Kings, and he quickly takes it. But Cyrus is granted as satrap, which is sort of like a local general, pretty powerful individual. And he starts with Tissaphernes a revolt, and he starts getting a couple of states to support him in Persia, most notably Cilicia. They provide a lot of financing, but one of his biggest flaws is that he hires the famous mercenary army from Greece, the army of 10,000. He also gets some mercenaries from Sparta as well. But, in Machiavelli's The Prince, he notes that mercenary soldiers should be avoided at almost all costs because they're not loyal and they will not fight as hard. And I can't remember the specific numbers, but he says something like in the magnitude of 10 times an individual who is one of the state is 10 times as useful as 10 mercenaries. And ultimately, Artaxerxes manages to put down this revolt and defeat his own brother, Cyrus, who actually ends up dying in the battle. One of the soldiers of Persia, Mithridates, accidentally kills Cyrus. So I think they didn't actually want to just kill Cyrus in battle. Maybe they wanted to try him for treason or something like that, but Cyrus just dies in the war, and that's the end of him. And I think this is largely, firstly, because he did not have enough public support. Most people in Persia supported Artaxerxes because he's the eldest child and he should have it, so he only managed to get a few allies on his side. And he relied a lot on mercenaries, which is obviously not the most effective way of approaching a war, or according to Machiavelli and according to most of history. And apparently Xenophon, who is a famous historian / philosopher, was actually fighting in this war, and he writes about how the army of 10,000 were then down in Persia after losing the battle. They got no pay and they had to walk all the way back to Greece. So once again, they were not very happy, and maybe they were more hesitant to support leaders from afar again. But either way, he gets involved in the Corinthian War. So Agesilaus II of Sparta, who were actually former allies of Persia, started to invade Persia. So they betray them, which is upsetting. And I reflected on this in an earlier life about Agesilaus invading Persia. Artaxerxes is actually very smart, and that's why he's considered the mindful. What he does is he subsidizes the Athenians and enemies of Sparta. So while Sparta is trying to move down southeast, they get attacked from the northwest by the Athenians. So they're sort of have to go back, and it's actually a very, very tactful thing. And I think that's one of the most important things about Xerxes to note, is that many of the battles he won without even having to fight them. So he knew how to play the political game, and he managed to do this very well. So with that, the battle breaks out between Sparta and Athens. With the money that they gave them, the Athenians actually managed to defeat the whole Spartan fleet at the Battle of Cnida, or Cnida, Cnida, I think. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, to be honest. But once again, see how he plays both sides of the political landscape. He sort of starts getting worried about Athens because they get too powerful. So he starts an agreement with Sparta, and he looks to create a treaty of peace. And obviously it's not really accepted. It's called the Treaty of Antecedents, and what it involved was Ionia and Aeolus going back to Sparta to appease them, and then otherwise peace. So this was his way of sort of undermining the Athenians and sort of getting a friendship back with the Spartans. And obviously this doesn't really go through. But back in the east, his father Darius II, just before he died, or right after he died, they lose much of their territory to Egypt. An individual named Nicocleides, and what he wants to do is he wants to take back much of this land. So what he does is he creates a massive army of 200,000 troops, 300 triremes, which is like a big warship, 200 galleries, and 12,000 Greeks who are mercenaries, which I think kind of contrasting his brother Cyrus, who his army was almost all Greeks, like 12,000 compared to 200,000 troops is not a lot. But these 12,000 troops were much better trained than the 200,000, because in Persia they were mostly slaves and not very well trained. But I think it's just interesting how quickly they could render such a big army. This is something like in Greece, even at similar times, they don't even talk about numbers nearly as big. Like 20,000 is a big army in Greece, but 200,000 in Persia was not uncommon to see. And sort of echoing back to like in ancient Rome, how they would elect a dictator in times of peril, because with a dictator it's no doubt easier to render an army, or no doubt easier to conquer lands, because if this was a full-out democracy, as they saw in Athens, like building an army is nearly impossible just to get it through, just to get popular approval. But one of the individuals on the other side in Egypt is Chabrias, who is one of a famous general from Athens, and he tried to get Athens to take Chabrias back and bring the mercenaries back to Athens, because he wanted to just fight Egypt in isolation, and he thought it would better his chances. But it ultimately didn't happen, and it ends up being a very, very poorly fought battle. The 200,000 troops, just because the sheer size, is too slow on arrival, so it gives the Egyptians and Nectanebo, sorry, I called him Neocletes, I called it wrong. It's Nectanebo was the king, or the pharaoh in ancient Egypt at this time. And what he does is he actually floods a lot of the land, and he blocks off many parts of the island. It's also the Nile, and this makes it very difficult for them to approach. And by the time this happens, many of the mercenaries actually end up having to go home, and Pharnabazas, who was the Satrap who was leading Artaxerxes' army, he was 7 years old, which is obviously not too old to be involved in politics or anything, but to be a general, I think, is a bit too old to be very effective. And maybe the slowness of the army was in fact just a mirror, or a reflection of their leader. And with this, a lot of people in Persia start getting very upset, and they start what's called the Satrap Revolt. It's mostly led by this individual named Datimes, who's one of the satraps, one of the more powerful satraps, and he is actually assigned to replace Pharnabazas, who is the head satrap who we just talked about, who is leading the army, slow guy, 7 years old. So this guy, Datames, is set to head the army and fight Egypt, but instead he actually breaks off his alliance with Aratus and actually brings the army the other way to fight against Aratus. And many other satraps actually support him and want to revolt, but just once again, I think just because, and I think the most indicative thing of his character, most important feature, is that he's very good at rendering support of his own people, and he ends up managing to put down this threat. And probably the main thing, the main cause of this also was Datimes, who is the head of the revolt. His own son actually ends up killing him, so his son becomes partial to Artaxerxes. So maybe that's because he believed in the actual lineage of the Persian Empire, or maybe his own father was so cruel, or maybe Artaxerxes was actually just so compelling by himself. So hard to say what happened there, but he manages to put down this revolt and stay in power. With this, there's Thebes is back in Greece, is getting very powerful. It's called the Theban hegemony, so they become a very, very powerful state, and they refused to return Messenia to Sparta. So they had captured Messenia from Sparta, and Sparta wanted it back, and they refused to get it. So once again, Artaxerxes actually advocates for peace. So he sends diplomats to Delphi to discuss this. Delphi is like the main religious center. It's kind of like, think of it as like the Vatican of Greece, but it really was just like an oracle, some like old ladies doing probably lots of drugs and such. But they used it as like a religious center, and it was also many times it did become controlled by certain states, but it was supposed to be a independent or autonomous vehicle in the land. So he advocates for peace, but this actually ends up upsetting the Athenians because the Athenians want to be free from the Theban hegemony too. So he ends up creating more enemies when in fact he just wanted what was good. And Chabrias from Athens very much opposes him, and Agesilaus also from Sparta opposes him. So I think the reason why they did this is because they were trying to get free from the Theban hegemony, but instead he was advocating for peace. So this was obviously not something Athens or Sparta wanted, and they wanted war, whereas Artaxerxes was offering them the option of peace. So Chabrias, the main general of Athens, and Agesilaus sort of get against him, and they put to death many of the opposers. At this time also, it's important to note that Artaxerxes was actually getting very old. He creates one of the most famous sites. I don't think it exists anymore. It doesn't actually exist anymore. The Tomb of Darius, which is his father. So here's a sketch of it. I can only imagine how amazing that is. It's interesting that architecture really hasn't changed, or hasn't, from an artistic standpoint, hasn't improved much, I would say. Maybe from a design standpoint, we can obviously build much taller buildings, but from an artistic standpoint, I don't think there's been much improvement. And here's his own tomb, which I imagine, or I believe they started within his own lifetime. And it's also, to me, it looks a lot like Petra in Jordan, which is, I think one of the most beautiful places in the world. I've never seen this tomb, but I would really love to. So he was also very interested in public works, and I think this is also just kind of indicative of his character. He wasn't like his brother Cyrus, who was just blindly wanted power, blindly wanted to conquer. He also believed in the arts, and he was much more mindful, and he also throughout his whole life sort of advocates for peace, as we've seen. And so at this point he's getting very old, and there starts to be sort of issues regarding who would be take his place in terms of the throne. So his eldest son is named Darius, and Darius is not the best guy. He has a lot of scandalous wives and a lot of scandalous sexual relations. But his younger son Archus is like probably a worse version of Cyrus. So he wants to contest Darius's right to the throne, even though Darius is the oldest. But fortunately for Archus, Darius actually sort of gets into a conflict with Artaxerxes. So Artaxerxes actually grants Darius as king very early in order to prevent any revolt or any sort of issues like he saw in his own lifetime with his own brother. But Darius actually goes against him, and he plots actually to kill Artaxerxes. So what Artaxerxes does is he thinks it's surprising because his own son is plotting to kill him, but he puts a secret door in his place, and he gets this eunuch, which is a person who has no balls, and they're usually pretty politically influential, but he has one of them spy on him. So eventually they tell him the exact hour that they're coming, and he lies there and he waits until he can see the faces of the killers, and then he runs out the door. And with that he catches Darius, and Darius is tried, and with that the executioner refuses to kill Darius because he doesn't want to kill a king. So Artaxerxes, despite his nature, despite his very kind and merciful nature, he himself slices his own son's throat. So I guess maybe it shows that he has the capacity for atrocity, or the capacity for, I suppose you could call it justice even. But what this did was it left Archus an even worse individual, because Archus was like worse than Cyrus. He was already plotting to kill Darius himself, but he was fortunate that this happened. But Archus ultimately becomes king, and his younger son Arispes obviously doesn't even have right to the throne, and he's very calm and quiet, but he had a very good relationship with Artaxerxes. So Archus is sort of paranoid and wants to have his own brother killed, just because he fears that something might happen, even though he was probably of the children the nicest one. But he hasn't killed, and this troubles Artaxerxes so much, and Artaxerxes at this point was 94, so very, very old, and sort of it troubled him so much that it said that it caused him to expire in the translation by Arthur C. Clow, or Arthur H. Clow. But Yeah, so that's the life of Artaxerxes. I suppose I'll move to the comparison. Um, I guess actually the quotes. Swiftly doth persuasion upon evil conduct make his way. This is just in regards to how quickly his children got corrupt, but it doesn't apply actually to Artaxerxes. But it's just a quote that Plutarch believed in and Sophocles believed in, and I think is important. And then another story about his kindness and generosity. It said that he accepted any gift, which is obviously like who wouldn't accept any gift. But if you're the king of Persia, it could be insulting if they don't give you all that they're entitled to or all that they're capable of. But this one individual, obviously Artaxerxes wasn't like this. He accepted any gift and he was very kind to any individual, as he proved throughout his whole life. But this one individual comes to him with an oversized pomegranate, and a lot of the individuals in the room are laughing. They think, what a poor gift. Is he mocking the king? But he says, by Mithra, this man would speedily make a city great instead of small, were he entrusted with it. So he actually saw goodness in this. He saw that pomegranate was obviously not a very impressive thing, but he saw that this individual was managed to make it a extra oversized pomegranate, which was impressive. So he said, if he were to lead like a city, he would have made it great, regardless of the size. So he really admired this of the individual, and obviously I admire Artaxerxes for this. So yeah, moving to the comparison. So they're similar. They both had royal blood that was contested by tyrannical or evil people, that being Abantides, Tidas, and Cyrus, respectively. And yeah, also later Neocles. But yeah, they both were very good at making allies from foreign lands, and they were willing to put their own sort of thirst for power, their own greed aside in order to make alliances and in order to work for a more common good. They both had somewhat mixed success as general, but they didn't lack ambition, and they obviously had great pursuits, and they were willing to fight great battles, but they didn't do so to the extent that they were extending themselves too thin. Artaxerxes, there was a pretty poor loss when he lost with the army of 200,000. That's pretty unimpressive. And the Aratus losing at Carphier was pretty unimpressive when he should have won. But despite that, they were it's statistically significant how many battles they won. And especially in Aratus's case, he braved many wounds and many injuries, so he was obviously not scared of battle, but probably just more prudent in choosing them. They were both calmer and kinder than their contemporaries, despite, Artaxerxes actually had to kill his own son, but they were, compared to the other tyrants that they were faced with, compared to Artaxerxes' own brother Cyrus, compared to Abantidas, they were actually quite calm, and they're considered the mindful, and they were very prudent in that regards. In terms of differences, Aratus was poisoned because he couldn't manage Philip. So maybe Philip was unmanageable, but he couldn't manage him, or he couldn't make things work. But Artaxerxes died of old age because he couldn't manage his own son. So in my opinion, that's sort of less impressive, in that Artaxerxes should have seen the issues that would become of his children, because he, within his own lifetime, witnessed a power struggle with his own brother. He should have seen that his children would be fighting against each other and having a difficult situation upon himself. So I think he's more in the wrong for not succeeding there. Whereas Aratus was really powerless in controlling Philip, especially when the advisors were against him. It wasn't even his own son. Philip was from Macedonia. Aratus was from Greece. It was surprising that he got as far as he did. Aratus tried to unify the people of Greece, and he put his own crown aside, whereas Artaxerxes was genuinely searching for more power. Like he obviously, when he was going for Egypt, he was trying to regain the state that his father lost, but he actually had his own self-interest. in mind, whereas Aratus put his own self-interest aside when he became strategos of the Achaean League. So I suppose maybe more honorable once again in Aratus's regard. I think Artaxerxes, he was more unclear of his intentions. Like sometimes he would be supporting Sparta, sometimes he would be supporting Athens, and it was obvious, actually maybe it is more clear, it's obvious that he really had his own self-interest in mind. Whereas when Aratus flip-flopped, his interests were in the common good of all Greek people. So I think with that, he had more honesty, and I think that's why Philip of Macedon respected him, whereas Artaxerxes could hardly win the respect of his own sons, and that's why he had a revolt in his own state. The satraps tried revolting against him because he couldn't. Maybe it was unclear, or it was clear that his intentions were self-benefiting, whereas Aratus was doing it for the common good of Greece. So yeah, that's it for Aratus and Artaxerxes. If you actually read Plutarch's Lives, you might note that there's no comparison for Aratus and Artaxerxes here. Some of them, I don't know if they're just missing, or if Plutarch didn't want to include it. I'm not sure, but for that I just came up with a comparison on my own, and I think there are many other points of comparison that not only I haven't covered, or that Plutarch haven't covered, between not only the duels or the parallel lives that we'll cover, but also across different parallels. For example, you can compare Artaxerxes with Brutus, would be an interesting comparison. But this is the way that Plutarch chose to unite them, and I think it's a good structure to follow. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch the next one, and perhaps even the preceding ones. Thanks so much. Bye.